A friend of mine retired in 2007 with $612,000 in his 401k. His financial advisor told him to spend no more than $24,480 per year. Adjust for inflation. Never touch the principal. Fast forward to 2023. He's 79 years old. I run into him at a coffee shop. He shows me his Schwab app. $1.8 million. He's been spending money for 16 years and somehow has 3 times what he started with. Here's what's weird. This isn't rare. I started digging through academic papers, money manager reports, real account data from BlackRock and Vanguard. Turns out roughly half of retirees following the so-called safe withdrawal rules end up with significantly more money than they retired with. Not slightly more, like double or triple. Which raises an obvious question. If the 4% rule is supposed to be safe, why does it leave so many people swimming in cash they'll never spend? I'm going to show you why the math behind retirement planning is fundamentally broken, how the incentives of the financial industry keep it broken, and the specific psychological trap that makes intelligent people underspend by hundreds of thousands of dollars during the years they're supposed to be enjoying their wealth. By the way, I built a free early retirement calculator because most online ones are mathematically wrong. It uses BlackRock and Vanguard logic to expose the weak points in your plan, and I only ask for your email to send the report, so I don't store any of your financial data. Link in the description. Here's the central metaphor I want you to hold. Retirement planning is like packing for a camping trip where you don't know if you're going for 3 days or 3 weeks. The 4% rule is the guy who brings 47 meals, 6 tents, and 3 water filtration systems because he read one article about someone who got lost in the woods in 1926. Sure, you'll survive, but you're going to be miserable carrying all that weight when a lighter pack would have been fine 95% of the time. The 4% rule was invented by a financial planner named William Bengen in 1994. He ran historical simulations going back to the 1870s. His question was simple. What's the maximum percentage someone could withdraw from their portfolio every year, adjusted for inflation, and never run out of money? His answer was 4%. But here's what nobody tells you. That 4% number was designed for the absolute worst case scenario. The person who retired right before the Great Depression. The person who retired right before the 1973 oil crisis. Bengen was building a rule that would work 99.99% of the time. That's not safety. That's paranoia with a spreadsheet. Think about this through the lens of insurance. You don't buy enough life insurance to cover the scenario where you die, your spouse dies, your kids get sick, and aliens invade simultaneously. You buy coverage for realistic bad outcomes. But retirement planning has somehow convinced an entire generation to insure against financial asteroids that statistically almost never happen. Now, you're probably thinking, okay, but isn't it better to be safe than sorry? Here's where the psychology gets interesting. There's this concept in behavioral economics called hyperbolic discounting. Humans are really bad at valuing future experiences. We'd rather have $100 today than $110 next month, even though that's a massive annualized return. Retirement planning flips this on its head. We're so terrified of running out of money in our 80s that we sacrifice real experiences in our 60s. The irony is, most people are healthiest, most mobile, and most capable of enjoying experiences in their first decade of retirement. That's when you can still hike Patagonia, still travel to Japan without worrying about mobility issues, still have the energy to learn new skills, but the 4% rule keeps you pinching pennies during your highest quality years because of a theoretical bad scenario 3 decades away. Let me tell you about a guy I used to work with. Called him Spreadsheet Steve. This man had a $400,000 portfolio, ran Monte Carlo simulations weekly. I'm not exaggerating, weekly. He'd adjust his grocery budget based on whether the S&P 500 was up or down that month. He wanted a 99% success rate on his retirement plan. You know what happened? He died at 71, cancer. Never got to do the things he deferred. His kids inherited $380,000 because he'd been so conservative with withdrawals. He barely touched the principal. He optimized for a 100-year lifespan when he got 71 years. That's not financial planning. That's dying rich and living poor. But here's where it gets really interesting. There's actual academic research on this. A guy named Michael Kitces, one of the legitimate thought leaders in financial planning, not some YouTube talking head, wrote a paper analyzing historical withdrawal rates. He looked at rolling 30-year periods going back to 1870. You know what he found? In only 12 out of 115 30-year periods did a retiree following the 4% rule end up with less than they started with. 12 out of 115. That's 10%. 90% of the time, you finish with more money than you retired with. 2/3 of the time, you more than double your wealth. Half the time, your wealth nearly triples. Read that again. Half the time, if you retire with $600,000 and follow the 4% rule, you end up with over $1.5 million. You spent money for 30 years and still tripled your net worth. This isn't a glitch. This is what happens when you build a withdrawal strategy around the 1895 guy who retired right before the worst economic period in American history. For everyone else, you're massively overshooting. Now, here's the kicker. The financial industry knows this. They've known it for decades. BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, published a report called To Spend or Not to Spend. They analyzed real client accounts, not simulations, real human beings with real portfolios. What they found was that 40% of retirees had 100% or more of their original principal after 17 to 18 years. Another 8 to 10% had between 80 and 100%. So roughly half of people weren't even touching their principal in any meaningful way. They were living off growth and dividends and just watching the pile get bigger. Why doesn't your financial advisor tell you this? Here's where incentives get fascinating. Financial advisors are generally paid one of two ways. Either a percentage of assets under management, typically around 1% per year, or commissions on products they sell. If you're a financial advisor managing $1 million portfolio, you make about $10,000 a year. If your client spends down that portfolio aggressively and it shrinks to $500,000, you now make $5,000 a year. Your income just got cut in half. Do you see the problem? The advisor's financial interest is directly opposed to you spending your money. They're incentivized to keep you scared, keep you conservative, keep that pile big so their percentage stays big. I'm not saying advisors are evil. I ran a financial planning practice for over a decade, but the business model has a structural conflict. It's like asking a real estate agent if now's a good time to buy. The answer is always yes, because they get paid when you transact. Advisors get paid when assets stay high. So the advice trend's conservative. Not because it's optimal for you, because it's optimal for the business model. Let's run a real scenario with actual numbers. You retire at 67 with $600,000. You're married. Between you and your spouse, you're getting $4,000 a month in Social Security. That's $48,000 a year. Pretty close to the national average for a married couple. Your portfolio is allocated 60% stocks, 40% bonds. Reasonable for someone your age. You want to spend $5,000 per month, which is $60,000 a year. $4,000 from Social Security leaves a $24,000 gap. That's exactly 4% of $600,000. Classic safe withdrawal. Here's what the math actually shows. If you run this through a Monte Carlo simulator, which just means running 10,000 different versions of your life with different market return sequences, the median outcome after 30 years is you still have around $550,000. The median. Half of scenarios end up higher. And the top quintile, the 20% luckiest scenarios, you end up with over $1.2 million. In some cases, closer to $2 million. You spent money for 3 decades and quintupled your net worth. But now you might think, okay, that's the lucky people. What about the unlucky ones? Fair question. The bottom of the range, the worst case scenarios in that simulation, you end up with around $200,000. Still not zero, still not broke. And remember, you still have Social Security throwing off $48,000 a year. The poverty line for an elderly couple in the United States is around $20,000. Your Social Security alone is more than double that. So even in the worst case scenario, you're not eating cat food. You're just not leaving as much to your heirs. This is the part where people's brains break. We've been conditioned to think running out of money in retirement is the biggest risk. But the data shows the actual biggest risk is underspending and dying with a pile of money you were too scared to use. There's a term for this. It's called the utility of wealth. $1 spent at 67 on a trip to Italy with your spouse who's still healthy has way more utility, more real happiness value than that same dollar sitting in your Vanguard account when you're 89 with limited mobility. But we don't think this way. We optimize for account balance, not life quality. Here's a short story that illustrates this perfectly. A guy named Jim worked as an engineer for 35 years, saved aggressively, retired with $900,000. His dream was to buy a small sailboat and spend summers cruising the Great Lakes. The boat he wanted was $60,000. His advisor told him that was reckless, that he should wait a few years, make sure the portfolio stabilized. Jim waited. Then his wife got diagnosed with Parkinson's. She couldn't safely be on a boat anymore. The window closed. Jim's now 82, sitting on $1.4 million, and the boat still docked in his imagination. He optimized his spreadsheet and sacrificed his actual goal. That's the hidden cost of over-conservatism nobody talks about. William Bengen, the guy who invented the 4% rule, even admits this. He wrote a book recently where he explores whether his own rule is too conservative. Turns out, if you're willing to accept an 80% success rate instead of 99.99%, the safe withdrawal rate jumps to between 5.75 and 6%. That's 50% higher than 4%. That's the difference between spending $24,000 a year and $36,000 a year on a $600,000 portfolio. That's an extra $1,000 a month, every month, for life. Now you're asking yourself, why would I accept an 80% success rate? Isn't 20% chance of failure too high? Here's the thing. That 20% failure doesn't mean you're broke and homeless. It means your portfolio might dip lower than you planned in certain years. And here's what actually happens in the real world. People adjust. You're a human being, not a robot. If the market crashes and your portfolio drops 30%, you don't just keep withdrawing the same amount and watch it spiral to zero. You cut back. You spend less that year. You adapt. This is what actual retirees do. The simulations assume you're a mindless withdrawal machine. Reality is more flexible. There's also this weird assumption that your spending stays flat in retirement. Adjusted for inflation, sure, but flat in real terms. That's not how humans work. Spending typically follows a smile curve. It's higher in your first decade of retirement when you're healthy and active. Drops in your mid-70s to early 80s when you slow down, then spikes again in your late 80s if you need medical care or assisted living. But the 4% rule assumes you're spending the exact same inflation-adjusted amount every year for 30 years. That's not a realistic model. It's a lazy model. Let me give you a different framing. Retirement planning should be built around regret minimization, not portfolio maximization. What's going to cause you more regret? Running your portfolio down to $300,000 at age 85, but having spent your healthy years doing the things you dreamed about? Or dying with $1.2 million in the bank and a list of trips you never took, hobbies you never started, experiences you deferred? For most people, the second scenario is way worse, but it's the one the financial industry pushes you toward. Here's a parable. Two farmers, both have 100 acres of land. First farmer plants 50 acres, saves 50 acres just in case he needs it someday. Second farmer plants 90 acres, keeps 10 in reserve for actual emergencies. After 30 years, first farmer's unused land has appreciated in value. He's land rich, but he produced half the crops, made half the income, lived a smaller life. Second farmer took more risk, but had more abundance, more production, more experiences. When they both die, their kids inherit land. But only one of them actually lived fully. Retirement portfolios are the same. You can die rich or live rich. Most people accidentally choose the former. The financial industry will tell you this is reckless. They'll point to sequence of return risk. That's the fancy term for what happens if you retire right before a market crash. If you start withdrawing money when your portfolio is down 30%, you're selling low and it's harder to recover. This is a real risk. I'm not dismissing it, but it's also dramatically overstated. The solution isn't to spend 40 years being conservative. The solution is to have a flexible withdrawal strategy. Spend more in up years, spend less in down years. Keep a cash buffer for the first few years so you're not forced to sell stocks at the bottom. These are tactical solutions, not existential reasons to underspend for decades. Here's another psychological trick your brain plays on you. It's called the endowment effect. Once you have money, you value it more than the things it could buy. A $600,000 portfolio feels safe and concrete. The experiences that money could purchase feel abstract and risky. So you hold the portfolio even when the experiences would objectively make you happier. This is why people die with money. Not because they're strategic. Because their brains are wired to hoard resources, an evolutionary adaptation from when scarcity was the default. But you're not living in a cave. You're living in an economy with Social Security, Medicare, and a portfolio that historically grows faster than inflation. The scarcity model is outdated. I've got a friend who's a hospice nurse. I asked her once if people on their deathbed ever regret spending too much money. She laughed, said she's never heard that once, not one time. What she hears constantly is regret about not traveling more, not taking risks, not spending time on things that mattered. The people who spent their money on experiences, they tell stories, they reminisce, they're at peace. The people who saved everything, they're bitter. They feel like they wasted their healthy years preparing for a future that turned out fine anyway. Now, to be clear, I'm not telling you to blow your entire portfolio on a yacht. There's a middle ground between reckless and paranoid. The 4% rule is paranoid. A reasonable approach is probably somewhere between 5 and 6%, adjusted based on market conditions and your personal flexibility. If you've got other income sources like Social Security or a pension, you can be more aggressive because you've got a safety net. If your portfolio is your only income, you need to be more careful. It's situational. Here's the 3-level framework I use. Level 1, calculate your baseline needs: housing, food, healthcare, insurance. The stuff you absolutely need to survive. For most people with Social Security, this is already covered. Level 2, calculate your quality of life spending: travel, hobbies, eating out, gifts for family. This is what makes life enjoyable. Level 3, legacy and buffer. This is money you're okay never touching, either as an inheritance or emergency fund. The 4% rule treats everything like level 3. It's all buffer, all legacy. That's insane. You should be spending aggressively on level 2, moderately on level 1, and conservatively on level 3. Real quick, 2 comedic cutaways. Imagine being the guy who invented the 4% rule. You run the numbers, publish the paper, it becomes the gospel of retirement planning. Then, 30 years later, you realize you made everyone way too scared and they've been underspending their entire retirements because of your research. That's gotta be a weird legacy. Hi, I'm Bill Benjen. I accidentally convinced millions of people to die rich and live poor. You're welcome. Or, picture this. You're at a retirement home. 2 guys comparing portfolios. First guy says, I followed the 4% rule religiously, never touched the principal, leaving $800,000 to my kids. Second guy says, I spent 6%, took my wife to 30 countries, bought a vintage motorcycle, learned to paint. Portfolio's down to 200,000, but I've got 0 regrets. Who lived better? The spreadsheet doesn't capture that. Let me bring this back to the original hook. Why do retirees with $600,000 end up with $2 million? Because the 4% rule was built for the 1 guy in 100 who gets apocalyptically unlucky with market timing. For the other 99 people, the portfolio grows faster than they spend it. The math is simple. If your portfolio averages 7% annual returns after inflation, which is roughly the historical average for a 60-40 stock bond mix, and you're only pulling out 4%, you're netting 3% growth. Compounded over 30 years, that's not just preservation, that's multiplication. The system isn't broken by accident. It's designed this way. Financial advisors benefit from big portfolios. Fund companies benefit from assets under management. Nobody in the industry has an incentive to tell you to spend more. There's no business model for spend down your wealth intelligently. So the default advice is conservative. Stay scared. Keep saving. Don't touch it. And you end up rich on paper and poor in experience. I spent 10 years working with accountants and fiscal lawyers who showed me how money actually moves. The wealthy don't follow the 4% rule. They spend aggressively because they understand something fundamental. Money is a tool, not a scoreboard. The goal isn't to die with the biggest number. The goal is to extract maximum utility while you're alive. Lazy investing built more fortune than crypto memes, but lazy thinking about spending destroys more life satisfaction than market crashes ever will. Here are your 3 practical takeaways. 1. If you have Social Security or a pension, you have way more safety net than you think. That income covers your baseline. Your portfolio is for quality of life, not survival. Spend it. 2. Run your own numbers with a realistic Monte Carlo simulator, not the garbage calculators most banks provide. Understand what 5% or 6% withdrawal actually does to your outcomes. You'll find it's way safer than the industry claims. 3. Build flexibility into your plan. Agree with yourself upfront that you'll spend more in good market years and pull back in bad ones. This one psychological shift eliminates most sequence of return risk and lets you live fully. The people who retire with 600,000 and end up with 2 million aren't lucky. They're following an outdated rule designed for a world that doesn't exist anymore. You've got a choice. Optimize your account balance and die with regrets, or optimize your life and die with stories.